Hi, everybody. Welcome to Horsepower Heritage. I'm Maurice Merrick. And greetings to all of you listening far and wide from places like Columbus, Ohio, Denver, Colorado, San Bruno, California, Bolton, Ontario, Canada, Melbourne, Australia, and County Cork, Ireland. Thanks for joining me for the last episode of 2022, and today I'll be paying tribute to 4 great men of motorsport who passed away this year. Also, don't forget to follow the show, leave me 5 stars and a quick review, and share it with a friend because all those things help me grow the audience. And if you're a racing fan, I think today is a special story that you'll enjoy. It's a look back at legends, and that's coming up right after this. This episode of Horsepower Heritage is sponsored by Model Citizen Diecast. No matter what's in your garage, you can fit all your automotive heroes on a shelf. And they've got you covered whether it's 1/43rd scale, 1/18th scale, or even the ginormous 1/8 scale masterpieces from the Amalgam Collection. Go to modelcitizendiecast.com and get 10% off when you use the promo code HERITAGE at checkout. Limitations apply. From race cars to street cars and everything in between, it's Model Citizen Diecast, because your inner child still wants to play with cars. For Porsche, the road to victory at the 24 Hours of Le Mans was decades in the making. And much like the development of their cars, it was an incremental process, rather than an all-out go-for-broke push. Their chassis and power plants evolved in sophistication from the 356 to the 550 Spider, then the 718, 904, 906, and so on. They achieved class wins along the way, but overall victory was elusive. By 1968, though, Porsche pinned its hopes on the 917, with its 4.5-liter air-cooled flat 12 rear engine, featherweight space frame, and very slippery bodywork. The 917 was a technological breakthrough in hundreds of ways, but it had an Achilles heel, which was aerodynamic lift at high speed. And that lightened the steering, which meant the car was all over the road and most drivers pronounced it totally unmanageable. That is, except for one standout. His name was Vic Elford. Instead of being scared off by the spooky handling of the 917, he seemed to feel right at home. Perhaps the difference was that Elford had been a rally driver, frequently living with unstable and twitchy conditions behind the wheel, with lots of throttle steer and sideways sliding. He was the first driver to rally the Porsche 911, and he did so with tremendous success, despite its reputation for wicked oversteer and swapping ends in the corners. And he became a rally driver out of practical necessity. Vic Elford was from a working-class London family, and he was drawn to racing, but unless you were a factory driver, it was a rich man's pursuit. Fortunately, he had a friend who was a rally driver, so he became a navigator and co-driver. Then he drove his own Mini, which led to a driving stint for DKW, and then Triumph. Ford signed him on for 3 seasons to rally their Cortinas. That period was a mixed bag of some wins, but also crashes and mechanical trouble. In 1967, Elford struck on a brilliant but risky plan. He approached Porsche's racing director, Baron Huschke von Hanstein, with a plan to rally the 911. Porsche wasn't interested in a factory rally program, but Hanstein wished him luck and lent him a 911, a factory mechanic, and limited technical support. Again on a shoestring budget, Elford prepared and tested the car, and himself. And to everyone's surprise, he won the World Rally Championship. Porsche was impressed and gave him a ride in a 910 at the wild and woolly Targa Florio. A mad dash over 45 miles of narrow, mountainous public roads, over hill and dale and through village streets. 10 laps of balls-out driving with thousands of spectators lining the course and the occasional sheep wandering into the path of the cars. Porsche made a 1-2-3 sweep, and Elford finished third with his co-driver Jochen Niersbach. The Targa Florio became his favorite race, and his performance there earned him a spot as a Porsche works driver. In an incredible streak, he won the 1968 Monte Carlo Rally, then the 24 Hours of Daytona a week later. Elford and Niersbach were second, behind Joe Siffert and Hans Hermann at the 12 Hours of Sebring the next month. In May, he returned to Sicily and the Targa Florio with co-driver Umberto Maglioli. After losing a wheel and falling behind the leader by 18 minutes, Elford dug deep and pushed his 907 to the limit, coming back to win. If all that weren't enough, he also started in a handful of F1 races in '68, and along the way he earned his nickname, Quick Vic. And that brings us back to the 917. Despite its frightening characteristics, Elford drove the long-tail variants at Le Mans 3 years running. Engine failures in 1969 and 70 and a misaligned gearbox in 71 put him out of the race each time. In 1972, Elford was driving an Alfa Romeo at Le Mans, trailing his friend Joe Bonnier, as he attempted to overtake a Ferrari Daytona. But Bonnier had miscalculated and he didn't have the room. Suddenly, Elford saw Bonnier's Lola airborne and spinning into the tree line. Next, he came upon the burning wreckage of the privateer Ferrari up against the guardrail, and he stopped to rescue the driver, not knowing he was already out and safe. But his friend Joe Bonnier lay in the woods, dead. For his heroism in attempting to rescue the driver, Elford received the National Order of Merit from the President of France. 2 years later, he retired from racing, but spent 10 years behind the scenes in various capacities, and his association with Porsche continued. He authored the Porsche High Performance Driving Handbook and Reflections on a Golden Era in Motorsports, both of which are considered classics. He had a long retirement in Florida, and he was treated like royalty at vintage events wherever he went. After a year-long battle with cancer, Vic Elford died on March 13th at the age of 86. Ferrari was founded in 1948, and the company's rise to the pinnacle of motor racing is nothing less than astounding. Just consider that within a year they had won the 24 Hours of Le Mans. In 1952, the great Alberto Ascari brought the firm its first Formula One Drivers' Championship, and through the 1950s the victories continued to pile up. It was as if there had always been a Ferrari, and in a way that was true, because Enzo Ferrari became a racing driver in 1919, and by 1929 he was running Alfa Romeo's factory team under his own banner, Scuderia Ferrari, or Ferrari Stable. One of his most trusted employees was a man named Mauro Forghieri, who worked as a mechanic and a machinist. Reclus had a son named Mauro, whose formal training in mechanical engineering was at the University of Bologna. He planned to design airplanes after graduation, but during an internship at Ferrari in the late 50s, Mauro impressed the engineers and drew the attention of Signor Ferrari, who was already close friends with his father, and he was offered a job. At 25 years of age, he was working under some very heavy hitters. First, there was Luigi Bazzi, Enzo Ferrari's right-hand man, a sometime engine designer, technical consultant, and all-around problem solver. Then there was Vittorio Jano, the gifted designer of the brilliant 8-cylinder engines of the 20s and 30s which powered Alfa Romeo to the World Championship. Bazzi and Jano each had 50 years of experience with Fiat, Alfa Romeo, and then Ferrari. And finally, there was 36-year-old Carlo Chitti, who'd come from Alfa Romeo in 1958 when they shut down their factory racing program. Formula One was entering a period of drastic change. It began in 1957 with a car called the Cooper T43, which was small, lightweight, and nimble with a 2-liter 4-cylinder mounted amidships. The T43 outhandled the big front-engine Ferraris and Maseratis, and within a few years, other constructors like Lotus and BRM would follow Cooper's example, mid-engine. Enzo Ferrari was skeptical about the mid-engine layout at first, supposedly joking that the horse should pull the cart. But Carlo Chitti was already preparing a prototype mid-engine car, the 246P, in late 1958. which was basically a proof of concept exercise. It was finally enough to convince the old man that it was the only way to remain competitive. In 1960, Kitty designed the Tipo 156, known as the Shark Nose. A rules change in Formula One limited engine displacement to 1.5 liters. They wanted to slow the cars down. And Mauro Forghieri helped design a 120-degree V6 for the Shark Nose. This was the car that Phil Hill drove to the Drivers' Championship in 1961. But it was a dark victory. The second to the last race of the season was at Monza in September. One of Hill's teammates was Wolfgang von Trips, who was the points leader going into that weekend, followed closely by Hill. On the second lap of the race, while making well over 100 miles an hour in a tight group of cars, Trips made wheel-to-wheel contact with Jim Clark's Lotus and ran off the course and up a grassy embankment, where hundreds of spectators were standing up against a chain-link fence. The Ferrari spun violently in the air, cutting through the crowd. Trips was flung from the car to his death. The wreckage bounced onto the track in a twisted heap. Jim Clark's Lotus passed underneath just ahead of the tumbling Ferrari, only narrowly escaping. 11 spectators were killed outright, and 3 more died in the following days. In the wake of Monza, a cloud hung over the inner workings of Ferrari, and it may have triggered what came to be known as the Palace Revolt. Tensions had been brewing between Enzo's wife, Laura, and some of the senior technical staff, who felt that she had inserted herself into their affairs, and that wasn't completely without basis. It came to a head in November 1961 when several key employees walked out in protest as an ultimatum to Enzo, and Enzo summarily fired them all. Among those to be excommunicated were Carlo Chitti and Giotto Bizzarini, who left the 250 GTO only half finished. But out of this turmoil came the moment of truth for Mauro Forghieri. One day the phone rang. It was Enzo. He said, "Forghieri, starting tomorrow, you are in charge of the racing department." And that was that. He was just 26 years old. One of his first tasks was to oversee the completion of the 250 GTO, which was raced with great success. At the same time, the FIA was allowing prototypes to compete in endurance racing, so Forghieri began work on Ferrari's first mid-engine prototype sports racer. The P-Series shoehorned a V12 and 5-speed transaxle into a tubular space frame. The Pininfarina-styled coachwork was an open cockpit spider, looking much like a lady's slipper. And with 310 horsepower and weighing just under 1,700 pounds, it definitely made for a hot shoe. In 1963, the 250P dominated, with wins at Sebring, Le Mans, and the Nürburgring 1,000-kilometer race. Engine displacement grew the next season, and the 275P and 330P took 1, 2, and 3 at Le Mans. The Ford GT40 presented some stiff competition for the later P3 and P4 cars, which were complex and fragile by comparison, and made in very small numbers. But they found victory at Daytona and Monza in 1967, and enough points to secure a manufacturer's championship title. Meanwhile, Forghieri was doing his best to sustain the F1 program, and engines up to 3 liters were once again permitted after 5 years of that 1.5-liter formula limit. But the racing budget was spread thin, and it showed, just as other manufacturers seemed to be thriving. British cars and teams and their drivers were dominant, while Ferrari was hit and miss. Misfortune and tragedy struck again in May of 1967 at the Monaco Grand Prix, when Lorenzo Bandini crashed coming into the Harbor Strait. His Formula 312 was instantly engulfed in a fireball, and he was trapped under the burning wreckage for nearly 5 agonizing minutes. Bandini died 3 days later. The loss was terrible. Bandini had the makings of a champion, and his death hit Forghieri very hard since they had become friends. All Mauro could do was to pour himself into his role as technician. One example was his exploration of improved downforce, using a rear wing for the first time in F1 in 1968. Another was the development of a flat 12 engine family in various displacements, which would lower the center of gravity on the chassis. Meanwhile, long-time financial strains forced Enzo Ferrari to sell 40% of the company to Fiat in 1969. And Fiat was an industrial behemoth in Italy, accounting for over 4% of the country's gross domestic product. They took control of the production cars, but Enzo would retain control of the racing department. For a short time, Fiat ordered Forghieri to work in their new design studio, but he was back to the Scuderia after a year, and not a moment too soon. Enzo was about to pull out of sports car racing and throw all their efforts into Formula One. So Forghieri took certain lessons from those sports cars and applied them to F1. It was all about airflow, because while a Grand Prix car at the time was much like a missile, a sports car was more like an airplane in terms of aerodynamics. Just as in the 917, considerations for lift and downforce were becoming critical. And perhaps like never before, Forghieri had the key ingredients to put Ferrari back at the top of Grand Prix racing. No distractions, a bigger budget, a fantastic flat 12 engine, and an excellent test track, the new Fiorano circuit, built by Fiat in 1972. But maybe the best ingredient in this new recipe was a quirky Austrian driver named Niki Lauda. He came into the Ferrari fold in 1974 with limited experience, but as they tested new chassis, together they dialed in every component with razor sharpness. And the car that emerged was the 312T. T for transverse gearbox, mounted to the rear of the engine but ahead of the rear axle. This moved the center of mass closer to the middle of the chassis, which was highly advantageous to its handling characteristics. It wasn't completely sorted before the 1975 racing season opener, but soon Lauda and his teammate, Clay Regazzoni, began to win races again, and in 1975, Niki Lauda became world champion in the 312T. The first driver to do so in a Ferrari since John Surtees 11 years earlier. He negotiated a new contract with Enzo, making him the highest paid driver in F1. And the next season, it looked as though he would take the championship for a second year in a row. That is, until the German Grand Prix at the Nürburgring, where he was in a devastating crash and fire that left him horribly burned. Were it not for the heroic efforts of fellow drivers who pulled him from the cockpit, he would have died. Against all odds, Lauda was back on the grid just 6 weeks later, still wrapped in bandages. And if you've seen the film Rush, you know the whole story. And if you haven't seen it, by the way, you are missing out. That is a fantastic film. Ferrari ended the decade with 2 more championships. Lauda in 77 and his replacement, Jody Scheckter, in 79. Forghieri led the racing department into the 1980s with the 126 series of cars, with a twin-turbo V6. It was a cantankerous beast in the offing, with long turbo lag followed by a rocket surge of power. And they struggled with squirrely handling and inadequate downforce. It was just one of many periods of difficulty for the Scuderia. But Mauro Forghieri said that Enzo knew the importance of experimentation, and he gave him room to make mistakes and never allowed the engineers and mechanics to doubt their boss's decisions. Enzo had lost his own son Dino to muscular dystrophy in 1956, and Dino was only 24 at the time, and he'd been working alongside Enzo since the company was founded. So with Forghieri, who was a similar age, it had become as much a father and son relationship as a professional one. With heavily reworked aerodynamics, they ultimately did tame the 126 Turbo, and they earned the Constructors' Championship title in 1982 and 83. Forghieri was now in his 3rd decade with the firm, and during his tenure, Ferrari won 11 world championships and 9 endurance titles. but there was little left to accomplish. Internal politics became a distraction, and things were changing. Most importantly, Enzo's health was in decline. One day in 1987, he told the old man, "I have to leave. I don't want to stay here and watch you die." And Enzo was gone the next year. Forghieri designed for Lamborghini for a time, and in retirement he took on whatever jobs he liked, many outside of the automotive field. And he may have been the last surviving link to the origins of Scuderia Ferrari, all the way back to the Alfa Romeo days of the 1920s. Mauro Forghieri died on November 2nd at 87 years old. Another Ferrari maestro, Nicola Materazzi, worked closely with Mauro Forghieri. He came to Ferrari in 1979 to work on the 126 Turbo. He was at least the best Italian engineer when turbocharging was concerned, having designed the engine for the Lancia Stratos Group 5 turbo rally car. Ferrari wanted to get a leg up on Renault, who were newcomers to F1 in 1977, with the first turbo engine in the sport, a 60-degree 1.5-liter V6. And even though they'd been notoriously unreliable, they had gobs of power, up to 1,320 horsepower. And they were going up against veteran teams running 3 liters. Remember, in F1 and in fact in endurance racing, you can go all the way up to the maximum displacement, but you have to be normally aspirated. Or you can scale that back and run a turbo or a supercharger. It's been that way for a long time. Anyway, despite a lot of engines blowing up, Renault was winning some races. So if they figured out how to keep things from grenading, they had the potential to dominate. And that's one reason Ferrari engineers got into the forced induction game. Originally, they experimented with an unusual pressure wave supercharger. It was called the Comprex. But they quickly found out that turbocharging was going to be much simpler. Materazzi had a rough start, though. He dealt with that turbo lag and then an angry power band that could come on quickly and make the car unmanageable. But eventually he cleared the hurdles and the 126T was a winner. Enzo then wanted him to work the same magic on the production cars, which had become pretty underwhelming. Remember, this is in a time when Fiat was in a malaise and so was Ferrari. Anyway, Materazzi thought he could get 400 horsepower out of the 3-liter V8. But there was one problem. Enzo had no control over the road car division because Fiat was responsible for it and they were not about to let him interfere. Crazy, right? And yet they did it. The car was called the 288 GTO. The idea was to run it in endurance racing, which would require them to build 200 road cars for sale to the public, a process known as homologation. And that's where things get really interesting, because the next step was to get Ferrari into the new Group B Rally Series. And the full Group B version of the car was dubbed the GTO Evoluzione. Surprisingly, Fiat executive Eugenio Alzati approved the projects. But after some gruesome fatalities, the FIA discontinued Group B. 6 Evoluziones were built before the project was killed. However, Enzo still wanted to ensure the future of Ferrari as the ultimate performance name. And out of that desire came the F40, in commemoration of the company's 40th anniversary. The 288 GTO and the Evo laid the groundwork for this new supercar. Materazzi was effectively given carte blanche to make it happen, and in just 13 months, the F40 was ready. It was revealed to the public in the summer of 1987, and it was the last car to have been developed with Enzo's direct involvement. For political reasons, Materazzi left Ferrari shortly thereafter, but he'd made an incredible contribution. And actually, I did an entire episode on this story. It's called Enzo's Last Stand. So if you haven't heard it, check out episode 36 of the podcast from September 8th, 2021. There's a lot more to the story, and although Nicola Materazzi is most known for these cars, he spent many years with Lancia as well as motorcycle manufacturers Laverda and Cagiva, as well as the Osella Formula One team. Nicola Materazzi died on August 24th at the age of 83. And finally, not many men these days could be described as dashing. It's seen as a bit old-fashioned, but it ought to be thought of as a timeless compliment, and it certainly described Alain DeCadenet, or DeCad as he was affectionately known. Rock and roll photographer, racing driver, pilot, automotive journalist, television presenter, and ladies' man. He was the product of a wartime romance. His father was a Free French Air Force officer, and his English mother a sometime Hollywood actress and later a fashion designer. Alain supposedly never met his father, but his mother's side of the family wasn't without resources, so they didn't starve. As a teenager visiting his mother in California between terms at boarding school, he moved in rather exclusive Hollywood social circles, and with movie star charm and good looks of his own, he fit right in. And the English accent certainly helped with the girls. Once he was out of school, a photography gig fell into his lap courtesy of a friend who owned a pirate radio station called Radio Caroline, which broadcast from ships offshore. It quickly became the hippest radio station in the UK. Without any experience, DeCadenet managed to muddle through convincingly with a camera, and it kept him in the midst of London's swinging 60s music scene. In those years, his transport of choice was a motorcycle and later old MGs. But he had no real interest in racing. But when a friend invited him to the famous Brands Hatch circuit one weekend, the model he was dating ran off with a racing driver. Within a week, he'd wrangled a motor racing license of his own and an AC Bristol Roadster, and he was on the track. After that, he was hooked, racing on the cheap with used cars, one a Porsche 904, and meeting some of the greatest professional drivers, learning the various tracks, and winning a little prize money here and there. And of course, there were pretty girls everywhere. But he was serious. Endurance racing became his forte. He took on all the big circuits, Silverstone, the Nürburgring, Monza, and Le Mans, and others, always by securing finances along the way from anyone who'd listen. And anyone who listened would be no match, because his lust for motorsport would have them hanging on every word and opening their checkbooks. He crashed at the Targa Florio after being hit in the head with flying debris, possibly a wheel that came loose from his own car. Privateer racing at that level is a rare thing today, and it's impossible without very deep pockets. It wasn't cheap in the early 70s either, but DeCadenet was skilled and determined enough to find his own sponsors, wheel and deal for parts, and even have his own cars built. He worked with Brabham, Lola, and McLaren at a time when you could still show up on their doorstep and pencil out the specifications, and they'd actually give you the time of day. For example, the first car at Brabham was built largely by a talented young engineer named Gordon Murray, who you may know from the McLaren F1. In 1971, DeCadenet made his first attempt at Le Mans in his Ferrari 512. With sight in only one eye after a bad concussion from that Targa Florio wreck, which tells you about the level of his skill and daring, or maybe foolishness. And with his French lineage, he was a favorite of the home crowd at Le Mans. DeCad was an amateur, of course, a gentleman driver, as they say, but he earned the respect of his professional counterparts. He had a terrific balance of bravery and confidence behind the wheel, tempered by an unassuming humility that allowed him to learn from the best. Drivers like Jim Clark, Graham Hill, and Jackie Ickx. And with all the cars he built, he was respected as a constructor as well. In 1977, Alain DeCadenet became a full member of the British Racing Drivers Club. And in 1980, he and his co-driver Desiree Wilson won 2 endurance races in the World Sports Car Championship Series, one at Monza and the other at Silverstone. After retiring from racing in the late 80s, he wrote for various publications, and in the 90s, Alain became the host of several documentary television series, most notably a show called Victory by Design, which was an in-depth look at the machines that made motorsport history. In each episode, he drove the greats, everything from the Alfa Romeo 8C to the Cobra Daytona Coupe. And he wasn't just on a little cruise around the track. He drove the cars at high speed on open roads, often speaking on camera as he put them through their paces. It's something a lot of people do now in the age of YouTube, but with Victory by Design, DeCad set the bar. It was a fantastic series, and it still holds up today, and his many talents were obvious. You can find it on streaming services, so look around if you haven't seen it. And probably the most famous clip of the show is DeCadenet doing a stand-up on a grassy airfield as a Spitfire bears down on him from the background, and the plane is so low it nearly parts his hair. His reaction is definitely memorable. DeCad had his own collection of great cars, and his prized possession was a 1931 Alfa Romeo 8C 2300 Touring Spider, which he drove in the Mille Miglia and other vintage events. He was never one to sit still, but in recent years he battled a rare form of cancer and sadly passed away July 1st. He was 76. And I, for one, will definitely miss his enthusiasm, all those great stories, and of course, that fantastic voice. And that's my look back at legends for 2022. Happy New Year, and I'll see you back here on Wednesday, January 11th for more of the people and the stories behind the machines. So until then, I'm Maurice Merrick. Thanks for listening.